Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Srecko Horvat, who is a philosopher and author who has published more than 10 books translated into 15 languages, including poetry from the future, What Does Europe Want? And Welcome to the Desert of Post-Socialism, and The Radicality of Love. He's the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and a council member of the Progressive International, and his latest book is After the Apocalypse. Welcome to Background Briefing, Srecko Horvat.
Hello, and I'm really glad to be talking to you and your listeners today.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I obviously want to talk about your book and all that you brought to the table here in terms of the future of mankind, the future of the planet. And you wrote your book, and then just as you were about to have it published, the COVID pandemic happened, so you had to go back and rewrite it. But before we get to the apocalypse here in the United States, we have a major threat against American democracy itself. We saw a manifestation of that on the assault on the Capitol on January the 6th. And now we're heading into an election. A recent poll in the United States a survey found that a majority of Republicans agree with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. And given that the Republicans plan to cheat and win the election in 2022 and take over the House and Senate by cheating, by suppressing votes, and by gerrymandering, etc., and they're quite naked about it. And so you'll have a situation where you'll have an election where the Republicans will decide, not the people at the polls, but the Republicans will just simply declare themselves winners. And there's likely to be a massive backlash. So here we are in the United States in the process of heading towards a kind of pseudo-democracy that you have in Hungary and Turkey and even in Russia itself. So I'm wondering how we could even get to the addressing the issues that are so pressing in your book about saving the planet and saving mankind from itself if our government itself is going to be paralyzed and even in a form of civil war. So that's my initial concern. Does this resonate with you?
Unfortunately, yes, because here over the pond, to say so, here in Europe, the situation is also worrying. I mean, democracy is dying out everywhere. You have authoritarian states, as you mentioned already, from Hungary, Poland, to many others. And you could have seen it also with handling the COVID-19 crisis and in which ways this kind of biopolitics surveillance state, or what some authors would call surveillance capitalism, is actually developing even further, even deeper, colonizing daily lives. And what I would say, having in mind what is currently happening in the United States, but also in all other places in the world, is that we are not just simply living after the apocalypse, which is the name of my most recent book, but we are also living after the end of history. Probably in the United States, people will still remember this famous thesis by Francis Fukuyama, that we reached the end of history and that liberal democracy is the only winner in town, which means that all societies are, so to say, naturally progressing towards more democracy, towards liberal democracy, and so on. But what you could have seen in the last years, and especially after the last financial crisis, 2007-2008, is that ideology is back from all sides. I mean, now you have the alt-right ideology, but you have also all sorts of apocalyptic movements, whether it is the libertarian movements from Silicon Valley, who are already buying, shelters in New Zealand, or dreaming these wet dreams of creating multiplanetary lives, so they will save their asses and go to Mars. But you have also this kind of radicalization of politics in which classical traditional democracy, even electoral democracy, is not here anymore. So unlike Francis Fukuyama, what we have today is actually the death of the end of history itself. We have the death of liberal democracy itself, and I would say that it was precisely liberal democracy itself which has led to this situation today with austerity measures, indebtment, privatizations, and so on. They actually created the fertile ground for this class struggle, which is now occurring not only in the United States, but everywhere in the world. Of course, your question is, how to deal with bigger threats and how to deal with bigger threats if we are still confined in the trap of nation states. Because I don't think that particular nation states, whether it's United States or Russia or France or Germany or whichever state, can alone face and deal with the current crisis which we have, which is on the one hand the climate crisis, and on the other hand it is the pending nuclear threat, which is higher than ever, actually. So the real question is, how do we go beyond this, I would say, anachronistic nation-state model? How do we reform or completely re-innovate major world institutions which are not really doing their role? Because what we face today is not just one lunatic in power in one particular country, it is the end of the world itself. So it is not something which United States alone can solve, which China can solve, but actually, as unpopular that might sound, China and the United States and Russia as well and other countries should come together and start solving this major crisis that humanity is facing. Because in 100 or 200 years, we might be nostalgic towards the times in which we are living today.
So is it possible then that we could have a global sort of awakening of consciousness of all the peoples of the world, recognizing that they're in lifeboat Earth together and the lifeboat is sinking? So as your book makes clear, that the climate crisis and nuclear risks present humanity with a choice between radical reinvention of our way of life or the end of the world, eradication. So those are the stark choices.
Yeah, let me try to pose you a test question, and to you and maybe those who are listening to us, whether you know what A74 stands for. A74. I mean, it's a rhetorical question because I also didn't know a few days ago. So apparently that's the name of the biggest Antarctic iceberg that is currently drifting and will probably be drifting for the next 2 years. It is 40 times the size of Paris and 73 times the size of Manhattan. But I doubt that this is something which we will read every day in the newspapers. I doubt that even when people hear this crazy news that there is an iceberg 73 times bigger than Manhattan, which will stay here for 2 years and then it will melt and then it will radically change also the climate of our very near future, I doubt that people actually can really understand it, me including. That's why in After the Apocalypse, I use this term which I borrowed from the German philosopher Günther Anders, which is called supraliminal. Usually when we speak about media propaganda and corporations trying to convince us to buy a new product, we use the term subliminal, which means that it is happening on a level which is much lower than our consciousness can perceive. So someone is actually fucking with us, and then in the end we go to the supermarket and we buy a product without even knowing why did we buy it, but we bought it because we saw it on television, for instance. But the term supraliminal means that something is so big that we cannot perceive it anymore, that we cannot comprehend it anymore. And I would say this A74, this iceberg, is one perfect recent example. It is so big that it becomes supraliminal, that we have something what I call, also again borrowing from Günther Anders, what I call apocalyptic blindness, that we become blind towards the apocalypse. And I think climate crisis is one of these examples. And the other example is, of course, the nuclear threat, because it's very difficult, even if we saw the bombs which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is very difficult to understand what was happening for decades in the Pacific in the Marshall Islands, for instance, with all the nuclear tests by the United States. And it's very difficult to really understand what kind of consequences, if we know that radioactive decontamination can last for thousands of years, what kind of consequences this will have for the future. So the most important question is, how do we deal with something what is supraliminal? How do we become not only aware of the apocalypse, but how do we actually act today if these threats are just multiplying and we have multiple threats at the same time? I wouldn't say the situation as dark as it might sound, that the situation is so bad, because I think the current pandemic didn't just serve as an accelerator of very bad things, including surveillance capitalism and biopolitics, but at the same time, COVID-19 served as a sort of X-ray machine, as a sort of revelation in the original meaning of the term apocalypse, which originally in Greek means uncovering, unveiling something. So the COVID-19 crisis, I think, unveiled the utter incompetence of nation states, the utter incompetence of governments. It also revealed in which way the rich only got richer, especially Amazon, Elon Musk, and so on. But at the same time, it also brought people together. I mean, it is sufficient to look at the United States. It wasn't just Capitol Hill as this kind of international performance act, which is reminding me of the 1920s and the Weimar Republic, but it was at the same time the Black Lives Matter movement. Look what's happening in Colombia these days. Look what's happening in Palestine. I would say that at this moment you have really a major planetary awareness about what is happening to the poor Palestinians. And you have so many solidarity marches, protests all around the world, even if many people are still confined or unvaccinated or living in a kind of constant state of exception. So I would say that people are aware, and you don't have to tell to someone in Bangladesh or on the Marshall Islands that climate crisis is real. They're affected by it every day. But what we have today, and this is the unprecedented task of our generations, and we are the future generations. The movements in the 70s were talking about, we are the future generations. Who knows how many generations will still come? And we have this unprecedented task to not only become aware of these multiple planetary eschatological or existential threats, but we have the duty and responsibility to act. And I think it's impossible, of course, we have to act on the local level, but it's impossible to really encounter these planetary threats unless we internationalize them, because they are already internationalized, unless we go beyond the very concept of nation state, unless we have a new international planetary movement, which would go even beyond the very term international, because that still means internations. What we need is to go beyond the nations, because in 100 or 200 years, it won't really matter whether you are from Bangladesh, from the United States, from Zagreb, or I don't know where, because the sea levels will already be rising. And all these threats which we are seeing these days, from earthquakes to rising sea levels to locust swarms to new pandemics and so on, this is really becoming our new normal.
So, Srecko, when you talk about the Marshall Islands, you are combining, of course, the two threats, the emerging nuclear threat or the continuing nuclear threat, and the threat of global warming with the oceans rising on these Pacific Islands where so much nuclear waste is because of the 1950s tests. You've got the Japanese now releasing tons and tons of radioactive water into the ocean. So the nuclear threat, in a way, is somewhat deceptive because we have the worst of both worlds. We have psychological disarmament, but not physical disarmament from the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. They still have thousands of nuclear weapons each. What concerns me is that in Russia itself, it's possible that right-wing hardline nationalists could take over from Putin, like Nikolai Patrushev, who's the hawkish head of the National Security Council, who's challenging Putin from the right. So you have a combination of the worst of both worlds. You have national security and organized crime. You have the mafia and nuclear weapons. So Does that concern you, or do you accept that notion? I mean, most people think that the most likely nuclear war would be between India and Pakistan, but I'm worried about the security of nuclear weapons in general, particularly in Russia.
Yeah, I must say I'm also worried about the state of security of nuclear weapons in the United States. Didn't those guys who stormed the Capitol Hill get very close, to provoke a nuclear war? And didn't something similar happen? I think it was a few years ago when there was this, you will probably remember, fake alarm that a nuclear missile was going towards Hawaii. And then, at the same time, CIA was tweeting about pandas and Trump was playing golf. But someone could have misinterpreted or interpreted it right because there was an alert and actually a nuclear war could have happened. So, of course, I'm worried about that. But what I try to show in my book, After the Apocalypse, is that we should be also very worried about other aspects of the so-called nuclear threat. What worries me so much is not just simply nuclear weapons. Of course, the situation is very bad. And it's not just United States, Russia, Pakistan, India. There are other players as well. But what worries me as well is also the use of nuclear power for different sorts of testings. We mentioned already the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands is a place in this part of the universe which over a period, over 12 years, more than one Hiroshima-sized explosion happened per day. So can you imagine a Hiroshima per day, 12 years? And of course, the United States left. The nuclear waste was not really managed as it was supposed to. Then climate crisis hits, sea levels are rising, and you already have something what philosophically we could call a sort of new ontology, that the very being of reality is changing because you have a combination of climate crisis and existing nuclear decontamination. What happened, for instance, these days in Fukushima is also very worrying that, the Japanese government decided to dump the contaminated water into the Pacific. And they've been doing this already. So what I'm saying is you don't really need a nuclear war. This is maybe Hollywood imagination that there will be a nuclear war or aliens and there will be a big major catastrophic event and then after that we will reach extinction. What I'm saying is that we are constantly in the process of extinction, and not only in the sense of all these species dying out and going extinct, but also of our reality ontology changing radically, transforming radically into a process which is ongoing, which might be a slow decay, which will of course be accompanied by civil wars, by destruction, by maybe going back to some sort of tribes or whatever, which you can see in science fiction today as well. What I'm really worried at is that there is no real difference between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. That as soon as you invented the atomic bomb, this is a knowledge which we cannot unlearn anymore, and this is a knowledge which we are still using all across the world, although there are other means of energy, although there are other sources of energy which are much safer given the climate crisis, which is leading to rising sea levels, which is leading to stronger storms, which can then affect nuclear power plants and so on. My point was that besides this, also the nuclear tests are still ongoing, and these are not tests at all. These are events which are already leaving a mark on planet Earth.
And of course, the other twin concurrent catastrophe in a way is the very notion that progress and catastrophe are two sides of the same coin. So capitalism itself depends upon growth, upon quarterly growth reports. So it's by nature extractive, and there's a limit to what the earth can endure. So one of the things that happened during this COVID pandemic was the fact that we weren't commuting so much. We weren't stuck on the freeways, poisoning the air, crawling along, going to work and coming back from work. People have now discovered that they can work from home. and there was a significant drop in global CO2 emissions in this last year as a result of COVID. So it's, in a way, the lessons are being presented to us, aren't they?
Of course, but I'm afraid that people will easily forget. And I'm also afraid that these short moments when, the cities were calm and there was not so much air traffic and ships, which are usually transporting the products globally, that they were also still for a moment, that will be distant past very soon. Although what you could have seen is that a simple virus, remember Evergreen, that ship which was stuck in the Suez Canal. A ship going stuck in the Suez Canal can actually contribute to less CO2 in the atmosphere. Maybe that's an instructive example how only in a few days, if global transport goes to a halt, or stops for a sudden moment, in which way that can actually contribute to the planet itself. Now, of course, this is very complicated because more than 90% of global transport still depends on ships, which are, floating around the oceans. But that's another reason why we should go thinking in the direction of radically transforming in the way extractive capitalism functions, getting rid of this extractive capitalism, which is based on extracting more resources, more values. And you mentioned that we are now working from home. What worries me is not just that this system, which is based on this illusion of progress, illusion of growth, because growth, this kind of growth is nothing else but actually a pre-programmed self-destruction, I would say. But that this system now is not only extracting resources anymore from the earth itself, but it's actually all the time, and we could have seen it now with COVID-19 and with this never-ending zoomification of life, that it is more and more actually extracting something what I would call libidinal economy, that it is extracting our own souls. Everyone who works from home these days, although these people are very privileged, of course, because there are many others on the so-called front line who don't even have the luxury to work from home. But many of those who work from home very often have the feeling that something more is being extracted from them than simply their time, And when I say something more, it is attention, it is emotions, it is very often unconscious, the unconscious itself, which is being extracted. So we don't even know that we are being exploited anymore. And maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, many people were happy, I can finally stay at home, I have more time and so on. But 1 year later, at least myself, I don't know about you, I'm very tired of that because, what is disappearing with this is the home itself. Previously, we had a home in the sense that you could retreat to home, you could meet your friends, have a dinner, you could have private conversations with your children or your family, you could just simply read a book and so on. But these days, I think the home itself become a public space. We are all having this kind of conversations or public events, semi-public events from our homes, which are then hosted on platforms of Silicon Valley companies. So again, you don't have really a public space in the sense of a public square or public TV or a theater or a cafe even. Even a coffee shop is very often a very political space because you can meet people, discuss politics, you can go for a protest after it. And what is most important in this non-digital space, what happens is something which is spontaneous. You can have encounters or your life can go into directions which you didn't even dream of. And what is happening now is that we are actually all becoming machinic slaves. I don't know how else to put it, but we are all becoming slaves of the technology itself. And it's very dangerous because many people are not really aware that they are becoming less and less free, but they actually think they are becoming more and more free because they are connected, they are online constantly and so on. They can order contactless delivery of food to their door, and then in a few years they will drive in self-driveless cars. But the basic problem of capitalism persists. And the basic problem of capitalism is this notion of progress, the notion that we are heading somewhere in the same way as the end of history, that we are heading somewhere which will be better, but at the same time, even if some cars will be green, even if we will order food and it will come to our doorsteps, this doesn't mean that extraction, expansion, and exploitation is ending. Actually, on the contrary, I think it is deepening and deepening even more. And at one point, it will just go over the threshold and there will be no return anymore.
And the second chapter of your new book, After the Apocalypse, is titled The Nuclear Age, Enjoy Chernobyl, Die Later. You went to Chernobyl, right, as what would you describe yourself as, a catastrophe tourist?
Yeah, I think that's a very good description. I went there as a tourist because what I wanted to see is precisely this tourist experience. Many people these days go to Chernobyl with the so-called stalkers. You will remember this term from the brilliant movie by Andrei Tarkovsky. But these days, these are the people in the so-called alienation zone or exclusion zone, which is much bigger than Chernobyl itself, who are drifting there, who are even living there. And, if you are really an adventurous spirit, you can go there and see things which you won't see with these classical tourist trips. But I wanted to go on a tourist trip. And why? Because I was interested in this, what I call in my book, commodification of the apocalypse. In this, it's not only tourism, it is connected to everything now. It is connected to fashion. You could have seen that even Tinder had this swipe night. Or still has it. I'm not using it, but I'm just reading about it, and I have some friends who use it, which use also the apocalypse as the main context of dating. So you can see that the apocalypse is becoming commodified, and if you go to Chernobyl in this kind of tourist trip, which became very popular after the HBO series Chernobyl, of course, you will come there and you will see that you can buy souvenirs, even the guides who will lead you through Pripyat, which was that city where more than 45,000 people were evacuated because of Reactor 4. You will come to the city and then the guide will actually show you pictures from the HBO series and say, oh, this is the place which in the HBO series was presented like this. And you can see that not only a sort of mediation is happening here, but also a commodification that we are actually at one point that was before the pandemic. But I think we are behaving similarly to the pandemic itself. You can see it with the fashionable face masks, for instance, and so on. That one way of reacting to such events, one way of reacting to such apocalypses is actually to commodify it, because it's very difficult to understand it. And when you come to Chernobyl, I can tell you, I wasn't there for a long time, and I was a tourist, as I say. But you can sense something which is, again, supraliminal, which is much bigger than you can even understand. First of all, because you cannot see radioactivity, you can only see the consequences. In this respect, maybe that's similar to COVID-19, because the threat is in a way invisible already, although it's not really invisible. And its consequences will last for decades, in the same way as COVID-19. Even if the pandemic is, put under control to certain degrees in certain countries, mainly in the so-called West, which is again a very result of Western policies, which were vaccinating their people first, and everyone had this first me perspective. But even if this pandemic goes under control also in other countries, mainly in the global south, look what's happening in Argentina, in India, in Brazil, in Africa, the consequences of this pandemic will take decades. In the same way the Spanish flu changed Earth, in the same way the Black Death led, for instance, to the destruction of feudalism and led actually also to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. So I think we have to have this long-term perspective in front of us, as difficult as it is, because we are all, of course, worried by our daily worries. And it's very difficult to plan the next week, and not to say to plan for the next 10 years or 100 years, which humanity as such should be doing.
So just in the last couple of minutes, why don't we talk about how radical reinvention of the world is necessary but also possible. So let's try and end on a hopeful note here, even though the title of your book is After the Apocalypse.
Yeah, but again, I mean, it might sound very depressive, and it was, to be honest with you, a very depressing few years of working on the book. So I would literally wake up and Google the apocalypse every day because I really wanted to understand how this term is being used. But then suddenly the pandemic happened, and later afterwards, a lot of earthquake happens in Zagreb, Croatia, that also brought me to try to understand the reality of multiple threats, because it's not just pandemic, it's utter air pollution, it's earthquake, it's volcanoes, as you can see in Congo now, and all these combined are actually an explosive mix, which is on the one hand very difficult to understand, but it's also very difficult to react to it. But to be hopeful, I think the very title of the book, After the Apocalypse, is already hopeful. The main point is that the revelation already happened, or different revelations, and now it's up to us to react to it and to radically reinvent the present. I would say on the one hand, the radical reinvention has to go in the direction of reinventing planetary institutions, because I think it's not nations or governments alone or one bloc or the other bloc which can lead us out of the crisis. It has to be a planetary response by humanity itself, and not only for humanity, but also for other species, for the biosphere itself, and for the future itself. Because maybe in 500 years there won't be humanity as such. Maybe there will be something else. Maybe in 1 million years an alien will land. Maybe they already landed. Who knows? And the consequences of humanity or of capitalism will be left on Earth. So I would say our major task is to recreate this spirit of internationalism, but also to organize it. It's not just enough to have a spirit. It is important to have organization. And on the other hand, I think at the very same time, so it's not an either or, we have to be constructing a radically different reality, temporality, social bonds, a complete social transformation on the local level. We have to be creating sort of autonomous zones, even counting on the disappearance of the nation state. You know, even if the nation state is back big time, you can see together with nationalism, together with this new Cold War between USA and China. But I can personally imagine a future where, nation states will disappear. And I would love to actually imagine such a future, which doesn't have to be better than this, of course. But what we have to do today is to make sure that this future will be better than our contemporary reality. To be more concrete, that means what you could have seen already with the pandemic. It wasn't just surveillance and biopolitics and all this state of exception which happened together with COVID-19. It was at the same time solidarity, mutual aid, but very concrete mutual aid, which is a concept which was being discussed by anarchists like Elisée Reclus or Peter Kropotkin 150 years ago. But you could have seen it today in action. You can see cooperation. You can see how important it is to invent different models of economy, which wouldn't function, not even on money. These are all the questions which we have to pose in our own reality. And in this sense, I think COVID-19 was an apocalypse, was a revelation, because many people really changed their lives. Of course, it's very difficult to change your own character, because it's an accumulation of education, experience, and encounters you had in life. But these kind of catastrophic events, which are planetary catastrophic events, actually lead people to radically rethink priorities in their lives. What is important? What is not important? What's the importance of friendship? What's the importance of love? What's the importance of solidarity? And I can see it everywhere in the world that people are actually reinventing it, and again, understanding the importance of something which is not money, which is not progress, which is not buying a new car or a new house, but actually something which is priceless, something which is, love. If you commodify love, this is the end of love. The same goes for friendship. So I think we have this kind of revolution against the commodification of everything, Of course, the threats are big, and it's not just climate crisis or the nuclear threat, it's also the developments in technology, artificial intelligence, automation, and actually the fact that all this technology is owned by a few white male dudes from Silicon Valley, or by China on the other hand, So I'm not here playing the China card. I think we should face both problems. But I remain hopeful. In my previous book, Poetry from the Future, I was talking about hope without optimism, in the sense that, I think optimism will not lead us very far because we will have a very unrealistic perspective of the future. Depression or pessimism will also not lead us anywhere, but we need this kind of hope without optimism. And I think this is the way out.
Well, Srecko Horvat, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for this inspiring conversation, and I'll be glad to come back at any time after the apocalypse.
And again, I've been speaking with Srecko Horvat, who is the philosopher and author. He's published more than 10 books translated into 15 languages, including Poetry from the Future, What Does Europe Want?, Welcome to the Desert of Post-Socialism, and The Radicality of Love. He's the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and a council member of the Progressive International. And his latest book just out is After the Apocalypse. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon, and this program is available for podcasting at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can sign up for our email updates as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this program, you can help us reach more listeners by taking a moment to rate and review us on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do share the program with friends and family and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook. And to help us sustain our mission and spread the word to keep us corporate-free and commercial-free, we have added a donate button. So if you're in a position to give support, please take a moment to visit backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible contributions will help us continue to build a reality-based community in post-truth America. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing. Bye for now.
Standing along the side of the pickup truck, a shot rang out in the night, just when everything seemed right. Another headline written down in America. The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared.